I hope everybody had a good lunch, and we're a little bit late, but apparently it doesn't matter, so we will proceed. And the next presentation is by Ash Roach. I think he's very well known to everybody. And so, Ash, please.
We've already seen the opening slide, but let's see if we can get it back. There it is. When Anik asked me to come here, I said, I'd love to come. And I said, what can I talk about? She said, whatever you want to talk about. So I'm talking about what I want to talk about. But in the context of things that are useful for you, I should start by thanking Anik and the organizers for having me come and be here. I'm good. Yeah, right. Yeah. Merci. All right. And I wanted to thank Ailey as well, because he's the one who actually spoke to me first in New York and said, you got to reserve these dates. So I promptly did. So I'm here and I'm grateful. And we're going to talk about two different things. And the slides contain much more than what I have time to address. And the paper, when you get to read it, has even more detail. But I'm going to give you a quick and dirty overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what I call marine data collection. And we remember we started the conversations yesterday morning with what marine scientific research, and what is that? And well, there is no definition. But there are other terms in the convention, and as Steve mentioned, there's some terms that aren't in the convention, but yet are used by the practitioners, both on the law side and on the science side, to describe their activity. And so I want to give you a sense of what the varying meanings are of the components of what I call marine data collection. And then the second half, I'm going to give you a quick and dirty overview of research vessels. That was the one thing that Anik mentioned to me, and I wasn't quite sure what she wanted me to do, but I have one slide that answers the question, but I have some other interesting information. And then at the end, I'll sort of summarize everything for you. And then there's a plug in the last slide about BBNJ and what we've done at the Center for Ocean, the Center for International Law at NUS in Singapore, and how it's relevant to many of you here with regard to the BBNJ negotiations. So let's first start with this concept of mine of marine data collection. And the question becomes one of what are the categories as I do it. And what I indicate there is, well, there is marine scientific research, but then again, it seems to me there's really two sorts of marine scientific research from a legal perspective. And that is, whatever marine scientific research is, the version of that, if you will, is subject to Part 13 of the convention with all its difficulties. But then there's also sort of what the operators do, what the researchers say. We're doing marine scientific research without necessarily implicating that what they're doing is subject to Part 13 and all of the regulations associated with that. Yeah, you wanted me to look at him, so I did. And just a little background as to what in the US, what our marine scientific research policy is, which is in many respects not similar to everybody else. And then I'll talk about the other forms of marine data collection and do some summary work on that. So let's start with what I think are the, if you will, the 4 categories and 8 subcategories of marine scientific research. There are things that are called surveys. There's hydrographic surveys and there are military surveys, neither of which are defined in the convention, but at least the hydrographic surveys are mentioned in the convention. What Steve talked about today was operational oceanography, and it seems to me there's several components of that, one of which is the ocean state estimation, if you will. That's what these buoys are all about. Then there's the use of some of that data for weather forecasting, and you saw how that's done. And then the ultimate will, if you will, relates to climate and El Nino, for example, and how you see that. And then there's a fourth category of what I'll call exploration and exploitation, because there you've got different things that are going on. If you're looking for natural resources in the area, for example, on the shelf, is that marine scientific research? It's not regulated under Part 13. It's regulated, if you will, under Part 11 or Part 8. There's environmental monitoring, which is required in the context of activities in the environmental impact assessment process. And then there's the whole question of shipwrecks, underwater cultural heritage, as it's now known, and those are certainly not natural as that term is used. So to give at least what we think about as what marine scientific research is, it's not an agreed definition by any means, but it seems to be most often used to describe the activities undertaken in the ocean and coastal areas to expand scientific knowledge of the marine environment and its processes. And to the extent that you're doing that, that's what Part 13 covers, with all of its difficulties and what have you. The concern about marine scientific research subject to Part 13, it relates to activities in the exclusive economic zone, where the requirement, if you're going to conduct that kind of marine scientific research, requires at least 6 months advance request from the relevant coastal state with all of the details of what you're going to do that's set forth in that. And that's time consuming. And as we heard yesterday, you don't always get timely answers. But if you're doing other activities that are not subject to the constraints of Part 13, then none of that applies. And whether or not you can do any of that in the EEZ depends upon whether or not you are engaged in one of the high seas freedoms, which is set out in Article 87 of the Convention. It seems to me that, again, back to the Part 13 side of the House, the data collected isn't required to be made publicly available until the results have been submitted to the coastal state. Very different when you're dealing with, let's say, the kinds of operational oceanography that is going on right now all over the oceans. And indeed, there are certain circumstances in which the coastal state can require its permission to make the data internationally available. Again, that's not the same way as we deal with the data from Argo floats, which is, made available regularly and publicly, and is publicly accessible through the system that the IOC has set up. So it seems to me you could look at it this way by sort of going into the convention. You've got research or survey activities, which are spelled out in what has to be done in the coastal state. And there's the legislative ability with regard to innocent passage in the territorial sea for not only marine scientific research, but also for hydrographic surveys. And that's consistent with the fact that the coastal state has sovereignty over its waters and the subsoil within that area. And then there's similar provisions with regard to vessels in transit passage of straits used for international navigation. There's a requirement there to not do any without prior permission. Again, consistent with the sovereignty that the archipelagic state has over its archipelagic waters, or if you're talking about, for example, in the Straits of Malacca in Singapore, almost all of the waters are territorial sea, and therefore under the sovereignty of either Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore. And finally, you've got the whole question of consent with regard to the continental shelf question in terms of what you're doing there. Now, it seems to me one can make the point that MSR is not subject to Part 13 if you're engaged on the high seas, if you're in the area, but you've got to do it consistent with the rules and regulations of the authority. Now, there are other forms, as I mentioned, they're listed here. I'm going to skip all the rest of the slides, which talk about all of those in detail, but you'll be able to have access to it because I want to make sure I have enough time to do all the other things. So, but I left them in here because we're going to upload all this, so you're going to have access to it. All right, let's turn now to the subject of research vessels. I went on Wikipedia to see what they said about that, and they listed almost 400 research vessels of one sort or another that are flagged in 35 countries. And then when they broke it down into what they call survey vessels, there are about 70 of them that are registered in some 18 countries. But who owns the vessel, who operates the vessel, what the missions are will vary over what they're going to do, and that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing you. I think you can engage, or you can categorize these kinds of vessels in terms of privately owned and operated research vessels of one sort or another. You can have government-owned, but they're privately operated. And this, at least in the US, is educational oceanographic institutions that do that. And then, of course, there's the third category of government-owned and government-operated. Although, again, in the US, they're generally speaking operated by civilian employees as opposed to military employees. Now, what about the data that they collect? Some of the vessels do that full-time as their mission. Others are done incidental to normal operations, and we've had examinations this morning, or that Steve mentioned, with regard to the voluntary observation ships or the ships of opportunity. Much less now than there was 10, 20 years ago. And of course, with the other things, we get more data back. The devices that are used, and you saw one here, are normally commercially procured and are operated from all three of these categories, and either with the expendable bathythermographs or even the deployment of the Argo vessels, for example. To answer the question that was posed to me about immunities, the issues of sovereign immunity, I think the answer is pretty simple, set forth in the convention, that only those vessels that are government-owned and operated for non-commercial purposes, all three of those subsets are required, would be entitled to sovereign immunity. If there's a government-owned and operated vessel that's operated for commercial purposes, it's not entitled to sovereign immunity. It's treated like an ordinary merchant ship. Now let's talk a little bit about the U.S. research vessels. And I'll start with the ones that are U.S. government-owned and operated. NOAA has 16 of them, and I'll show you the varieties of those in a minute. The U.S. Navy has 13, again operated by what they call USNS, the U.S. naval ship. That's the terminology that indicates that they're civilian operated normally by the Maritime Administration. And then there are the U.S. government-owned privately operated vessels, which are run either by the National Science Foundation, and 5 of those are in that system. 4 of those are used as part of what's called UNOLS, the University Ocean System. I forget what the full title is. That's right. There's always somebody who knows more than I do. And then there's the privately owned, which are almost universally. Oh, that's right there. It's right there. It says it. National Oceanographic Laboratory System. And there are 18 of those that are government-owned, but are operated by them. Now, in terms of NOAA, it's interesting. They have 5 hydrographic survey ships. They have 1 multi-purpose oceanographic research vessel, 1 that's dedicated to exploration and discovery, and there are 9 fisheries and other environmental resources. And here's pictures. Here's the Ronald Brown, which is sort of the queen of the research vessels. This is the little one that is owned and operated by NOAA, but it's really in domestic waters, designed to test out new equipment and do local mapping. There's the Oceanus Explorer, which is the one that's involved in the examination of what's going on around the world. It's a unique ship in that regard. There's a closer up picture of it, but you can see you can't quite tell just by looking at what it is, but they all have hull numbers, and the hull numbers are different. On the Navy side of the house, just to give you some pictures of those as well, there are two general purpose oceanographic research vessels, the Neil Armstrong and the Sally Ride. They're both really modern ships. And then there's 6 oceanographic survey vessels. And note the words, if you will, or the acronyms in parentheses. That's how you can tell what they are. The 2 research vessels are AGORs, A standing for auxiliary, general purpose, and that. Hydrographic surveys are again, T again stands for operated by civilian employees of MSC. But those are all AGS. That's how you can tell the difference in terms of the names as to what they are. And to start with, here's the Neil Armstrong. Quite a modern ship. The Sally Ride has only been in service for about 2 years. I think this has been in service about 6 years now. This is one of the oceanographic survey ships. It's called the Bowditch. It's one of 6 that are listed there. And when you're dealing with one of those, notice at the stack where there's a blue and yellow stripe around it, and that's how you can tell that it's a USNS ship. And then there are the surveillance ships, of which there are 5. But again, notice it's TGAOS or TAGOS, and one of them, this one, has been famous out on the Pacific side of the house because there's concerns, let's put it this way, that China and India have had about their operations. On the NSF side of the house, there are 4 that are part of the UNOS fleet, as I said. One that's operated by the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. There are 2 icebreakers in the Antarctica, and there's 1 ocean drilling ship. It's part of the International Ocean Discovery Program. Here's a picture of the I can't pronounce Joides, but that's the one that's part of the International Ocean, the DP program. All right, so that's sort of where we are, but let me just close with a series of slides that gives you the sort of the summary of the way I look at it and what's set forth there. Not all methods of collection of data about the oceans is MSR subject to Part 13 controls. But there are, of course, lack of definitions otherwise, and that's differing views about what the legal regimes are and what you can do, and those are the 5 bullets that are there. And from my point of view, we need to have understanding and clarification, and I hope the work that Anik has asked me to do will help in your regards. It seems to me that if there was a requirement that all forms of marine data collection would have to be under coastal state control in the EEZ. It seems to me, as you saw from what Steve provided, that you deprive the people of all nations of free and open and timely access to data that enhances their safety and the environmental protection of their territory and their peoples. And it seems to me, therefore, that nations must facilitate access and data sharing if their citizens are to benefit from the kinds of conclusions that are being drawn from the large-scale data sets that we've seen described here today, particularly in the periods of change with varied impacts, which we're only too aware that it's occurring. And there's the quick of what I've said about the research vessels. What we should notice, I think, is the last bullet there, that a vessel that is supposed to have a mission that says certain things can and not happen. For example, if they're a military survey ship, They ought not to be doing marine scientific research in the same place, because then it gets really confusing to people. This is a quick summary of who can regulate. I won't go through that. Let me close with this. Monday and Tuesday of this week in Singapore, we had an international conference that we entitled High Seas Governance, Gaps and Challenges. And interestingly enough, much of what the panels talked about were some of the very things that we've been talking about here in the context of that. So the results of that, the PowerPoints and summaries, will go up on the CIO website. It's not yet up today. Maybe it'll be next week, but that's where you will find it. And in that context, back in January of 2016, we held a preparatory conference for the BBNJ negotiations, where Sophie and others were there and made very useful inputs to delegations who really needed to learn. And to the extent that you're new to this, you want to know more about the various kinds of things, there's an extensive report already up on the CIO website, which is at that website, which provides a detailed report of what was said under Chatham House and the PowerPoints. And so it's, together those two, I think, are very useful sources to go to if you're interested in learning what's happening. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ash, and thank you for sticking to time. So the final speaker in this panel is Fred Soons. And again, I don't think he needs any further introduction. And I would also ask Fred to try to stick to about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, yeah, that's the presentation. Well, first I would like to thank INDEMER and especially Mrs. de Marfie for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference. I've learned a lot. Secondly, when I prepared my presentation, I did not know, of course, what exactly the other speakers would cover. And I'm fortunate that I can build on both yesterday's opening panel and the afternoon panel, in which already a lot has been said about the legal regime and some practical experience, but also now with the factual background, Steve Piotrowicz and Ash Roach explaining the various categories that I will be, again, referring to for the purpose of my presentation. So with a slightly different approach, I will cover some of the same things that were just covered by Ashley Roach. I also myself have a few questions left from yesterday's panels, and if I have 1 or 2 minutes at the end, I will mention those as well, because they are related to the theme of our panel as well. In fact, what I propose to do mainly now is to make a few observations and raise some questions in the hope that during the discussion time, you will give your views on those issues. Now, following now my prepared presentation, and you will notice again some overlap with especially the previous one, which allows me to go quickly through some of my prepared slides. What I first will have to do, of course, is explain two notions that are included in the title of my presentation, the notion of new technology, but also the notion of marine scientific research. Then, very briefly, I have to say something about this new technology. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a lawyer. But I'm so fortunate that Steve has, just before the lunch break, already told you a lot about the new technology, so I will be able to refer back. And then, given the limited time, the topic is, of course, in principle, a vast topic, but given the limited time, I will focus on the applicability of part 13 to the operation in particular of floats and gliders. And I'll explain why I think that is appropriate and make a few suggestions about possible development of the law. The two elements in the title of the presentation that I should explain, new technology, well, very simply, that is, for me, in this context, technology that was developed since the adoption of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That means so roughly since 1982. And why? Because the UN Convention, and in particular its part 13 on marine scientific research, is primarily based on the use of research vessels, the classical way, you could say, of conducting marine scientific research, although the use of installations and equipment is also covered in some provisions, which in fact transplant those, the provisions on the research by vessels to also installations and equipment, with all kinds of questions that raise. Aircraft are not mentioned in part 13, but in my view, they are simply, if they are collecting data in the course of marine scientific research, subject to the same regime as marine scientific research. But what is interesting is, of course, that remote sensing from space, from satellites, is not covered by the part 13, by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I mention it as an interesting, just as a background note, because that collection, remote sensing, collection of data, is essentially free. And satellites have been collecting data for years, the kind of data that are also collected at sea, in situ, but under the consent regime, which is, I think, an interesting thing to think of when you look at the concerns of states with respect to the collection of data. Now then, the other notion, research. The term research and marine scientific research in the convention, and as it is used, perhaps is slightly misleading often in discussions, because the legal regime of part 13, essentially the crux seems to be the actual collection of data and samples and the conduct of experiments in situ. That was the main concern why this was included in the convention. But research, of course, involves the data are collected not just for nothing, they are there for analysis and subsequent evaluation, which is mostly conducted, not always, sometimes on board ship, but mostly conducted afterwards in laboratories on land. Now, the legal regime in part 13 also covers to some extent that subsequent phase, but as a sort of as a consequence of the regulation of the in situ collection of the data. So most provisions focus on the marine data collection part. Perhaps I should mention that the subsequent part, the analysis, etc., there is also, of course, the duty in general to promote marine scientific research and to cooperate. That's a general, that covers marine scientific research in general. But also, for instance, the duty to assist states, coastal states, if they request, in analyzing and evaluating data. Now, as we know, part 13, full consent regime, deals exclusively with marine data collection for marine scientific research, as was just also by Ash Roach explained. You should really look exactly at what is meant and covered by this notion in part 13. To me, the crux, ultimately the essential criteria, is the intention of public availability of the research work, the collection of data, subsequent analysis, etc. Why? There is no definition in the convention. We know that. It was mentioned several times already. It was difficult, of course, to find an acceptable definition, a definition that was almost sort of adopted, refers to marine scientific research as any study or related experimental work designed to increase mankind's knowledge of the marine environment. Now, mankind's knowledge, increase mankind's knowledge, means open publication, to me, at least. And it's interesting to note that this phrase, which was part of the original, the last draft definition for Part 13 in the late 1970s, is in fact included in Article 246, paragraph 3, that states must in normal circumstances grant consent for this kind of research. Now, so you could say perhaps that data collection not for publication or open availability essentially is not marine scientific research covered by Part 13 regime. Other data collecting activities are excluded because they have separate legal regimes. Resource prospecting and exploration, hydrographic surveying, with some qualifications perhaps, no time to deal with that in detail, military survey as well. And then possibly operational oceanography. I say possibly because that's the crux of the question that I hope to address in a moment. Operational oceanography, I use a definition from IOC, systematic and long-term routine measurements of the ocean and their rapid dissemination, near real-time dissemination and interpretation. Now the new technology, oh, I didn't know I could do this, that I even have slides with, anyway. Floats, gliders, I will give you the complete slide here. Floats, gliders, Steve Piotrovic has shown you pictures. And submarine cables are also sometimes used, and there are projects for increased use in the future for existing submarine cables for collecting oceanographic data. Now, of course, mammals are not technology, but I should list them here because the use of marine mammals to put sensors on them is also an innovation. Then, of course, you have submersibles, manned or unmanned, drones. You could have unmanned research vessels in the future, small unmanned research vessels that could do many of the things that fully crewed research vessels nowadays do. And then, of course, there are all kinds of improvements in observation and data collecting. You can see on the slide what I mean here. I focus just for the rest of the time on the floats and gliders because their use poses most questions concerning the adequacy, if at all applicability, of the UN Convention Part 13 regime. For instance, these drones, I think, are fully covered by the current regime. There's no reason why that should create any problems. Oh, I just wanted to, since I have only slides with text, I thought I should have at least one slide with a picture, with a glider. The reason I chose the glider, because the glider is slightly different from the float in the sense that, as I understand, gliders have some capability of remotely controlling their direction. To some extent, their direction could be controlled, which makes it different from the floats, the Argo floats or other floats that are, once they are put in the water, they are left for the currents, ocean currents to for the direction that they take. Now, again, gosh. The applicability of Part 13 to the operation of floats and gliders. The issue surfaced first with respect to the Argo program, so a specific use of floats. The advisory body of experts on the law of the sea, of the IOC, dealt with it, was requested to deal with the topic of the legal framework for the collection of oceanographic data within the context of UNCLOS. And that led to the adoption of guidelines for the implementation of the Argo program resolution earlier in 2008. These guidelines were adopted by the IOC Assembly. And that's the interesting part. That resolution introduces an optional notification system for Argo floats that may enter an exclusive economic zone. At the same time, the resolution reiterates again that the Argo program must be carried out in full compliance with UNCLOS, with the convention. So supposedly these two things are not contradictory, They are, the notification system is in full compliance with the UN Convention. 11 member states of the IOC have opted into this system. You see the names of the countries mentioned on the slide. In those cases, the Argo Information Center notifies the operator of a float when a float approaches at roughly 100 nautical miles an EEZ of one of those 11 states, and the operator then notifies the coastal state. The coastal state, according to the resolution, may also request that data it considers to be of direct significance for the exploration and exploitation of natural resources not to be distributed. But interestingly, such a request has so far never yet been made. Of course, this is a reference to Article 246, paragraph 5 of the UN Convention. Now, in the discussions in ABELOS, some of you know this very well, having participated in all these discussions, different views were expressed on whether or not Part 13 applies or not. Some members expressly stated that the MSR regime applies to the Argo program. And they refer to Article 258, for instance, of the Convention, which says that the deployment and use of any type of scientific research installation and equipment is subject to the same rules as I mentioned before. Other members regard the operation of Argo floats as operational oceanography. We all know what that is now, not governed by the MSR regime. And that view is in large part, I think, based on the 1980, during the third conference, statements and a letter also by the chair of the third committee of UNCLOS 3 regarding concerns expressed by the WMO, principally in light of the World Weather Watch practice of routine meteorological observations by voluntary observing ships. The latter view may be seen as an extension of what was included in the 1980 statements to extension to operational oceanography generally, so broader than the Argo program. Now the question then arises, is operational oceanography a subcategory of marine scientific research, but perhaps with a specific legal regime? Or is it an entirely separate activity, under a separate legal regime? Or are only parts of operational oceanography perhaps part of a separate regime? I'm not giving you the conclusion here now, because I think that that the correct conclusion can only be reached, and perhaps not even at this moment, on the basis of a study of subsequent state practice of the parties to the convention, which practice includes, in my view, the IUC Argo notification system. An example of where this issue may come up again in discussions is the expansion or extension of the Argo program. As you know, the current Argo notification system is based on an understanding of the program as reflected in these resolutions of 2007 and even the original Argo resolution 1999. Since then, the properties measures have expanded, in particular biogeochemical, and they will expand. Technology will progress. This development, I think, may need to be reflected in a new decision by the relevant IOC bodies. In my view, you cannot just accept this expansion of the Argo program without sort of full transparency within the IOC about what exactly is being collected, etc., etc. Now, another option in this connection might be to use Article 247 of the Convention, a provision that was intended to provide for a sort of a simplified consent procedure for MSR by or under the auspices of an international organization in cases of the involvement of sort of a larger number of a long-term program with a larger number of the coastal states involved. And the IOC has adopted an internal procedure for the application of Article 247, again prepared by ABELOS, adopted in 2005. However, in my view, that current procedure is ineffective and will never be used simply because although it has it provides a clear procedure for preparing a decision by the IOC to adopt a project for this purpose, it still then insists in notification 6 months in advance for each individual entry into a foreign EEZ, with the possibility of coastal state objection within 4 months. So I could see that the planners of such a program would see not really much benefit in going through that procedure twice. So maybe that procedure will have to be adopted, the IOC internal procedure adapted, changed in order to make it more attractive and even to have it used. And by the way, for some states, to use this procedure or the 247 procedure could be unattractive because it would be a recognition of the Argo program as being MSR. Development of the law, well, perhaps the conclusion can be drawn that the current Part 13 of UNCLOS is not fully adequate for the operation, at least of floats and gliders generally in the EEZ, because it is impracticable because of this 6 months advance request notification with very specific indications of the exact date and place of entry into an exclusive economic zone. That is why we have this Argo notification system in place. Now, what could be done? Continue to develop the regime in practice, which in theory could result in a sort of a tacit modification of the UN Convention and or new rules of customary international law in view of the fact that some states are not yet parties to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. With both options here, operational oceanography as a subcategory of marine scientific research with a special regime, a notification regime for instance, or as a separate activity with a separate legal regime. The other option would be not this development in practice, but a formal amendment or even a new conventional rules, implementation agreement. I don't think that is really a practical option. So it seems to me that to continue the development of the regime in practice would be, at the moment, policy-wise, perhaps the wisest option, but I would be very much interested in your views. If I may use the final minute or two, I think, of my presentation for the questions that I announced that I had after yesterday's presentations. I got the impression that, especially in the first panel, that there really is, that the practice so far with the current consent regime is mixed. And although to some extent it is, scientists have adapted and researching states have adapted to the regime, there also seem, for instance, to be areas that are avoided by scientific institutions, and the question is that really was that the intention of the regime, and is that good for science or for the world in general? Problem of slow responses or non-responses from coastal states, with two possible explanations, one being problems with internal bureaucracy, the other explanation being, for instance, suspicion about what's going on, how do we assess? The question, of course, is then what can be done? Is there a role, for instance, for the IOC, an increased role perhaps for the IOC here? And what was mentioned yesterday was, for instance, was Article 251 of the Convention, which encourages states to promote through competent international organizations, and the IOC would seem to be the competent international organization here, the establishment of general criteria and guidelines to assist states in ascertaining the nature and implication of marine scientific research. So the question is, would that not be now an appropriate role for the IOC to look into, to see if some clarification can be provided through such general criteria and guidelines? By the way, there is some irony in the reactions or even sometimes non-reactions from coastal states with respect to applications for consent from abroad, in the sense that at the same time, as far as my information goes, Many research projects, when they have been executed with consent of the coastal state, the research institution, of course, they follow the procedure by submitting the research results to the coastal state, but very, very seldom the coastal state exercises the rights that it explicitly has under the convention to request from the researching institution through the research state assistance in analysis of the data and to explain the results. So to me it seems there is some irony that on the one hand coastal states are sometimes anxious to grant permission, and at the same time some of those same states, but also other states, perhaps don't fully realize what entitlements they have also that can benefit them. And maybe here again, IOC perhaps could be more promoting this side, for instance, of the regime to encourage the conduct of of research. Well, I think I'm now, I'm even beyond my time, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fred. And at this point, can I ask Steve and Andre to come back onto the podium, and then we could open the floor for any questions to any of the panelists from this morning or from this afternoon. Yes, I see. It's not easy to see from here, but I see a question there.
Yes, thank you. My name is Nathalie Soisson, and I would have a question for Mr. Roach. I'm wondering how what we call now collaborative science fit in the legal regime. I have in mind a particular American association actually, that is called the International Seakeepers Society. Maybe you know it. And so they work with the University of Miami, and they use yachts owned by the members of the association to take some samples, make some observations, and they can go as far as putting scientists on board, or even having particular projects for sharks, for example, where they catch sharks, they tag them, and they release them. So I suppose that when you cruise the Caribbean, take a few samples, you don't need any control, that's fine. But when you have scientists and you take sharks somewhere in the Caribbean, maybe the yacht owners don't know exactly where they are, whether it's the territorial sea, high seas, or whatever. So how do you put the control there, or if any control?
Okay, let's collect one or two questions and then we can distribute them amongst the panel. So, yes. Microphone is coming.
Thank you very much. I did appreciate a lot the interventions. And I would like to put a question. The fact that we are talking about activities about collecting of data, activities which for some states are not covered by the term scientific research. This fact could not lead putting the question of the applicability concerning the economic exclusive zone of Articles 58 and 59. 58 concerning freedoms which are related to other freedoms which are mentioned relating on the high seas, first of all, within the economic zone, and the following article about the residual rights, the conception of residual rights, rights which are, have not been attributed or mentioned in the convention, and for which there are special rules about the settlement of disputes. Thank you. Upon equity and the parties. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There's one question here, and then we'll get a first round of responses.
Merci beaucoup. Jean-Louis Bissuel, consultant maritime international. J'ai deux questions, une concernant l'Arctique Et donc le Conseil de l'Arctique plus particulièrement. Donc ce matin, effectivement, il y a eu un certain nombre d'interventions, notamment celle de Monsieur l'ambassadeur Segura. Moi, j'avais une question. Est-ce qu'on ne doit pas s'orienter vers un statut particulier des pôles en tant qu'intérêt général maritime pour l'ensemble de la planète et faire en sorte qu'effectivement, même si les États côtiers ont un intérêt très particulier, mais que l'ensemble de la communauté maritime puisse être concerné par les décisions qui peuvent être prises concernant l'Arctique. Alors je voudrais dire à ce sujet, donc on a parlé de la navigation ce matin, effectivement, c'est un fait, effectivement, il y a un développement, et notamment on a parlé de la croisière. Je voudrais simplement dire que ce n'est pas forcément un fait acquis et garanti. Il faut savoir qu'il y a quand même des problèmes qui persistent, notamment concernant le sauvetage. Actuellement, alors bien sûr, l'OMI a mis en place un code polaire qui permet d'avoir des navires adaptés, mais il y a quand même des problèmes spécifiques à la navigation dans l'Arctique qui ne sont pas actuellement résolus. Et deuxième question, ça concerne les déchets plastiques, les déchets en général, les déchets plastiques. Moi, je crois que c'est vraiment un problème extrêmement grave. Alors, ma question, c'est est-ce que ce problème ne devrait pas être érigé en cause mondiale, comme le réchauffement climatique? Parce qu'on a évoqué, et Annick de Marfy a évoqué effectivement le rôle des États, on a l'impression qu'on se sent incapable de faire appliquer effectivement des normes en la matière, et je pense bien sûr aux déchets telluriques. Il y a bien sûr les conventions régionales, mais moi, pour avoir vécu à l'intérieur de la Convention de Barcelone, aussi bien du côté sud, où j'ai été en poste en Tunisie, et également du côté nord, France et Monaco, pour moi, la Convention de Barcelone a une efficacité quand même très limitée. Ce matin, on a vu ce qui se passait, par exemple, au Liban. Je crois que c'est vraiment une cause mondiale qui me paraît être digne d'un traitement unifié. Et une micro-question à l'intérieur. Donc, ce matin, on n'a pas évoqué le devenir de l'ingestion des microparticules de plastique par les organismes marins dans la chaîne alimentaire, et notamment au niveau de la persistance éventuelle des métaux lourds concernant cette chaîne alimentaire. Merci.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with Ash. Certainly one. The first question was directed to you, and if you can answer any of the other ones, go ahead, and then we can pass down the panel.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for these excellent questions. The first question that we came related to a private organization that was engaging in some activity that could be characterized as research. And to the extent that the coastal state where they are, would assert that that's what they're engaged in, you've got the kinds of problems that exist now with regard to other activities. On the other hand, to the extent that we were talking in the example about tagging, in one sense, that's really not research. It's just providing a mechanism for identifying the mammal or fish when it's seen again. My own sense is that by and large, it's not the kinds of research which is subject to Part 13. That's my own view. On the question of 87 application to the residual rights question, bear in mind that the provisions in Article 58.1 in effect incorporate by reference the relevant provisions of Article 87. And when you're talking about the freedoms of the high seas with regard to scientific research, the caveat is that it's subject to parts 6 and 13. 6 being the continental shelf and 13 being what we've just talked about. So to the extent that the activities are engaged in matters which would be research of the shelf or fall within Part 13, the whole question of residual rights, it seems to me, doesn't even arise. But you do have, of course, in Article 57, a requirement that the activities that are engaged in pursuant to the freedoms have to be done with due regard for the rights and duties of other users, which would also include, of course, the coastal state. I can give a partial answer to the third question, which were related to the poles, in the sense that it's very clear that most states, the EU perhaps is an exception, take the view that the waters of the Arctic Ocean are no different legally than the waters of the Atlantic or the Pacific, and therefore are governed by the law of the Sea Convention. And therefore, there's no need for a new legal regime that deals specifically with the Arctic. Of course, in the context of Antarctica, you do in fact have a special regime because you've got the whole Antarctic Treaty business, including the Environmental Protection Protocol that associates with that. But that's a consequence of the 1958-59 treaty, so that it's a little bit different that way. I don't have a good answer for you on the question of microplastics, because that's really in the beginning, but I just should make one comment with regard to the Polar Code that you raised. And that is, the Polar Code is not a separate, independent, standalone provision with regard to standards for operating in polar waters. It's a supplement. It's a supplement right now to SOLAS and to MARPOL, and it will be, in addition, a supplement to the standards of training, certification, and watchkeeping. But it was created because you had to deal with the special conditions of operations either in the Southern Ocean or in the Arctic, where it's dark, where the weather's terrible, where you can't communicate, there's lousy charting, and all of the things that you have to take special care about. So in that context, there already are global rules on that side of the house in terms of what we're talking about.
Thanks very much, Ash. Fred has nothing further to add. Andre, any comment about the Arctic in particular, or plastics?
No, about the Arctic, I just would like to remind that Monaco suggested some years ago a proposal on all the high seas, the Arctic high seas, the ABMZ, to be object to discussions to conservation special measures. We are living, but definitely, if we consider the Traité de Madrid, the Madrid Treaty for the Antarctic, we are really living worst period for geopolitics, and I think it's hardly to imagine now in the actual situation to have a special status for the Arctic. I think, sadly, we are quite far to have this possibility now.
Thank you. I'd like to comment on the seakeepers item, because we've worked with seakeepers. And the Arctic Argo program, led by the U.S. and France in particular, have great outreach activities with these volunteer organizations. They're used for educational purposes, publicity to much extent. And in particular in the Mediterranean, where you noticed in Fred's presentation, there are 4 countries that have asked for notification of floats that enter their EEZ. The way the people who implement those floats, which are primarily France and Italy, is through collaboration. And that's an aspect of capacity development, and in following up on Fred's comment about teaching on the use of the data. So these outreach activities with intergovernmental organizations like Eurogoose or something like that, and with NGOs have been very, very productive for a program like Argo and for the Drifting Buoy program.
Thank you very much. We have time for just a couple more, and let me just remind you, before I give Annick the floor for a comment, that one of our panelists asked you some questions, which is unorthodox, but he did. But let me give Annick the floor, and then I see a question here.
Thank you, Michael. I have a question from Fred, which probably will show that I have not followed so carefully what happened on marine scientific research lately, particularly within the IOC. But I could not but remember the question of the audace that we had to deal with after the adoption of the convention, when we spent time to try to find, what could be a legal regime or an applicable procedure. And so my question is the question that you raise about Argo the same that we were raising in the 80s about this audace? Sado en français. Thank you.
Can we get the microphone over this side? Ah, yeah. Right there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Farah Hourghami, I work at the Mediterranean Science Commission. My question would be for Professor Soons. You have outlined the subject is for new technology and the law of the sea, and you've concentrated more about the drones, but I have a question on submarine cables, and I think maybe some similar problems in the EEZ can be asked, especially for the new submarine cables who had a hybrid regime. At the same time, they do communicate, so there is a legal regime separate for that, and then they are doing MSR, and they are two different legal regimes or are opposite in that area. And then my question is, if we have all of these new technologies, not only one, that are posing kind of the similar problems, and especially in the EEZ, why shouldn't we consider tackling them in a new institution, in a new convention, in a new forum, anyway, soft law or conventional law, and deal with them rather than leaving it for the customary law? And we know already that some states, they have expressed their refusal of any consideration for one legal regime or the other, which means that by practice, customary law cannot be made in either one or the other component of it. So that was my, and then thank you a lot for your handbook on submarine cables. It's really helped me through my thesis. That was something personal.
Thank you. Fred.
Thank you for these questions. First, the draft ODAS convention. I think the last version dates back to 1993. That's the last revision that was made, the last text that you will find on the internet. The draft ODAS convention, also the last version, is much broader. It deals with many more issues than purely the deployment. Goes to state rights over their deployment. It also deals with issues of liability and markings, etc., etc. But if I'm right, I think that the current draft, or I'm not sure it's really in a formal sense still a draft, but the document that you would find assumes simply that, as in the convention provisions, Article 256, etc., their deployment is subject to Part 13. So that convention, in fact, does not solve the questions that we have before us with the Argo floats. That question is still there. And that leads me to the second question, or a couple of questions. The second part, of course, deals with how to develop the law. I'm not sure that you first started with the cables. I think it was a separate question, but then it flows over into the more general question about the new regime, hybrid cables in particular. But in my view, as soon as a cable is activated to collect data, it is no longer purely a telecommunication cable. If it was purely originally a telecommunication cable, let's assume that, not a different kind of cable, telecommunication, which has its separate regime. But if it also starts to collect oceanographic data, you enter into this realm whether or not this is covered by the marine scientific research regime or not, perhaps operational oceanography, if that is an accepted category. So then you enter into this problem. In principle, I would be inclined, at least that's a position I've taken in a publication in the book on submarine cables, chapter on marine scientific research, that the Part 13 regime applies in principle to also hybrid cables, and let alone, of course, standalone cables for collecting marine oceanographic data. But I think your general question was more that you sort of questioned my idea that for the time being, the development of the law could perhaps better be left to the practice. And why not a new agreement? This is I look at it from an academic perspective. This is a decision for diplomats and government officials, and they have to assess what they wish to achieve, what the outcome would be. And I think that government officials would only enter this process of trying to get agreement on a complete set of rules on marine data collection, new developments, when they think that there is a sufficient chance that the outcome would be in line with their preferred choices. I suspect that at this moment that is simply not the case. So what do you do then? You leave it to practice. But again, it's interesting to note that in actual practice, it seems to work, at least with the Argo floats. So, and cables, I'm not sure if they're already hybrid cables in function. They are already.
There is like some specialized MSR,
Yeah.
But there is some hybrid, and then there is now the use of the traditional cables, and then put it on them some surveys instruments, and then the question is.
You can't be heard, so there is some practice, as you are saying, and I'm not sure if that practice really at the moment creates such big problems that states want to have start negotiations on an explicit regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm certainly aware that there is a suggestion that there is a program, I think it's called DOOS, Deep Ocean Observing System, which is a variant of GOOSE, where the idea is to add some attachments onto cables to take passive measurements, and I think that's the sort of situation you're talking about. I do see another question at the back, so let's take that, and all right, two more questions, and then I think Ash might want to make another comment.
Bonjour, je suis membre d'une association qui est à Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, qui s'appelle SOS Grand Bleu. Et dans le débat, je suis assez étonné de ne pas voir développer l'aspect éducatif. Je dis ça pourquoi? Parce que nous développons beaucoup de nos moyens pour faire voir à des jeunes la mer, leur faire connaître la mer, les facteurs sensibles de la mer, le rôle que la mer joue dans l'équilibre géostratégique. Et donc, je pense qu'au-delà des normes nationales et internationales, certes, qui sont indispensables, je pense qu'il y a un rôle vraiment important dans le facteur éducatif, mais vraiment dès le début, pour que les décideurs de demain soient vraiment sensibilisés à cet aspect, à ce rôle primordial que les océans et la mer jouent. Et puis, je voudrais ajouter une autre chose, mais c'est tout à fait une suggestion. Ici, Monaco est le siège français et monégasque du sanctuaire Pélagos. Pélagos est un sanctuaire qui part à l'ouest Saint-Tropez, à l'est Gênes et qui va jusqu'au sud de la Sardaigne, qui est un sanctuaire dans lequel il y a des actions qui visent vraiment à faire un repérage des mammifères, à faire un contrôle du développement de la faune, et c'est un travail vraiment sur le plan écologique qui est vraiment important. Cette ONG avec d'autres ONG s'applique beaucoup dans ses rôles éducatifs et de données, de récolte de données, pour donner aux scientifiques, pour faire en sorte qu'il y ait un travail vraiment de connaissance, de prise de conscience et des responsabilités. C'est plus un je n'ai pas une demande particulière, c'est plutôt un témoignage. Hein, voilà, c'est tout. Merci.
Okay, thank you. And let's take a last question over here, and then we really should just take one more round from the panel. Thank
La
you.
connaissance des océans au service du développement durable. Permettez-moi, monsieur le modérateur, je suis professeur Blivy Adoté Blim. Je suis surajouté aux participants par le biais du secrétaire aux relations extérieures, monsieur Kouma. Le grand titre que vous donnez à cette conférence internationale est un titre mondial. Et les discussions que j'ai suivies depuis ce matin à aujourd'hui, à 7 heures, ce sont les questions juridiques qui touchent le monde. Mais lorsqu'on considère les nouvelles technologies, professeur Soons, le différentiel océanographique s'accentue. C'est-à-dire que des groupes de pays continuent d'être puissants en hydrographie et en océanographie, pendant que d'autres s'affaiblissent, ne peuvent pas connaître correctement les milieux océaniques, et ce caractère disparate caractérise le monde. Si on met en place la connaissance des océans au service du développement durable, cela veut dire que des partenariats nouveaux doivent être installés. Comment l'Institut du droit économique de la mer et l'Institut océanographique ici à Monaco pensent ériger de nouveaux partenariats avec la COI et d'autres institutions qui sont sur la mer? Cette question m'intéresse. Professeur Soons a laissé tomber délibérément l'observation militaire de la mer. Aujourd'hui, en Afrique, d'où je viens du Togo, nos militaires sur la mer n'ont pas de guerre à faire. Mais ils ont des équipements pour aller en mer. Seulement, ce qui manque, ce sont des équipements à installer pour pouvoir contrôler la mer. Est-ce que le panel que vous constituez, j'ai vu Noah, j'ai vu les autres, est-ce que vous pouvez nous aider à développer le concept océanographie, hydrographie opérationnelle militaire en Afrique?
Okay, yes, thank you very much. So let's just go around the panel. Fred, do you want to? No? Andre?
Yes. Thank you for the questions on education and capacity building for Africa. I'll try to answer to the two at the same time. I think the Tara Expedition Foundation has a big will to educate, and we are producing educational tools since 10 years. And it's really a threat. It's not easy to marry education and big science, and it's also a job that others has to do, not the scientists. The scientists, they are there to do science, and big science is really a challenge in these times. So it's not easy, and we have few organizations. We are really investing in this bridging science to education, but I think we have lots of examples of successful educational tools linked to science, and please go to the, s'il vous plaît, sur le site de Tara Expedition, on a toute une partie sur l'éducation, il y a des vidéos éducatifs, des PDF à télécharger, vous pouvez vous servir. Je continue à français pour répondre à notre ami du Togo. Je pense que c'est un défi aujourd'hui, le capacity building et l'inclusion des pays du Sud. Nous, je ne sais pas si vous étiez là à ma présentation sur les consortiums Taha-Océans, mais le consortium Taha-Océans, effectivement, a travaillé pendant plusieurs années qu'avec des pays du Nord. Et nous avons donc sollicité l'Agence française du développement qui nous aide en ce moment. Et depuis 2 ans, donc, il y a des pays du Sud qui rejoignent les consortiums de façon très concrète, avec des postdoctorants qui viennent dans les labos, et on implique les institutions du pays ensuite pour les retours de ces postdoctorants avec un projet régional à la clé. L'idée, c'est de ne pas simplement payer des bourses et faire venir des postdoctorants, mais les inclure dans un projet de haut niveau et ensuite travailler avec les pays, les institutions pour qu'ils puissent retourner avec de bonnes conditions chez eux. Et puis j'ai le plaisir de vous annoncer que nous avons un doctorant de l'université de Lomé, un Togolais donc, qui va être financé dès cette année et qui va donc rejoindre les équipes de Villefranche-sur-Mer du professeur Lars Steban. Donc c'est un doctorant togolais qui vient dans les consortiums Taha-Océans. Et nous essayons d'impliquer des pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest dans un projet complémentaire à Taha-Océans qui va travailler sur l'Atlantique Sud, sur l'application des mesures biologiques en complément des programmes d'observation de l'Atlantique Sud. Donc c'est une grande préoccupation de la Fondation Taha, mais je vous rejoins dans le besoin d'investir dans les capacités building, mais concrètement et scientifiquement, pas seulement parler capacity building, parce que comme nos collègues du groupe Afrique de BBNJ le disent, je cite notre collègue Joy Millie de l'Afrique du Sud, before learn to swim, we still need to learn how to float.
On the question of capacity building, which you raised, and it's clearly one of the 4 main topics in the BB&J discussions that are going on. But at the last session, the IOC made a very, very significant intervention, which made reference to their outreach strategy that they've adopted, and the fact that they have put online this vast collection of data called OBIS, which links things that Tara has and other institutions. And the Seabed Authority has a similar data set for training programs, and both in terms of at ISA and also the work that has been done by the contractors pursuant to their obligations. And my understanding is that there's a similar set of data portal available in the CBD Secretariat. And so what I think is going to happen is that because the 3 institutions are already in this business, that the one improvements that could be made to their websites is to have external links to the other 2. And then if that were to occur, in my sort of humble opinion, in the call for a single access point from the lesser developed countries, it already exists. And is Google. Because if you know what you want, you type the terms in, and all 3 of the sites will come up, and then you just go and figure out what system you want, where they are, what training you want, what's available. And so I think there is answers to your question, but I don't think it requires a whole lot more effort because there's an awful lot of opportunity out there. It's just a question of making the knowledge that it exists more widely available, and I think this is a way to do it.
Thanks, Ash. And while we're on commercials for various things, I can point out that a few years ago, ISA worked with the government of Brazil, in fact, to produce a data set of all collected geologic data between West Africa and Brazil across the Atlantic. And tried to make that available for the benefit of West African states in particular. But I think, if I can just add one more comment arising from what Andre and Ash just said, there is a big difference between data and information. You have to have data, but then you have to make data meaningful and be able to publicize it, disseminate it in the form of information that is useful. With that, I think we have exceeded our time. Thank you very much. But it was a very interesting discussion. I would like to thank all the panelists for their very excellent presentations, for sticking to time, and for contributing to, I think, what has been a very interesting and useful discussion. So thank you very much. And now do we switch panels or coffee? Just thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.